Okay, welcome back to Lit Matters, and for the second part of a two-part video on Macbeth in context. Here we're looking at the 6 to 10 in terms of contextual factors that might be of use to you when writing a Macbeth response in an exam or writing a Macbeth essay. Number 6 is the divine right of kings. Now this is an idea you need to get your head around. Shakespeare is very much writing for James I in his audience. He is a king who's just come down from Scotland, who is super interested in the supernatural and who may very well have threats to his crown. And so Shakespeare gives him a play tailor-made for him. Now, Shakespeare also is trying to perhaps get us to reconsider our concept of a king or kingship or what the monarchy is. Now, you need to get out of your head any sense of the sort of Disney-fied model king that is loved by his people and is noble and handsome and gorgeous and all the rest of it, and very, very honest and all of that rubbish. This is a violent, brutal, dog-eat-dog world. There's no police, there's no minimal sort of justice system or human rights and all the rest of it. So whoever is in power is the most ruthless, powerful head of the biggest militia, essentially. Whoever's got the biggest army and is more violent and more ruthless than anyone else will take power. And of course, that is a fairly thuggish, violent, dog-eat-dog world. Who's got the bigger teeth? And the kings didn't like to think of themselves like this. They liked to think of themselves as much more holy and chosen by God, even. And so the divine right of kings is a political, religious doctrine that the monarch has no one to answer to on earth, and his right to rule comes directly from God. So he can't be swayed by the will of his people or anyone on this earth, including members of the priesthood and the church. He is answerable only to God, and that's it. And it's a very clever it's a very clever strategy, because once you are the king, then you say, you can't question me, you can't challenge me, because you're going against God. If you do so, you're doing the most unnatural thing imaginable. And so you could intimidate and terrify any opposition or any other claimants to the throne by saying, you're not just going against me, you're going against God. And you can expect divine punishment for that. And so even in a case such as Macbeth, when you've committed regicide and you have usurped the throne, you then turn around and say, well, God moves in mysterious ways. I can't explain all the workings of God, but if I am king, then that must be because God wants me to be king. So it's a very powerful sort of self-fulfilling, self-perpetuating argument, and it's one that Macbeth and any other tyrannical king of the time would have used to have justified their power, and perhaps to avoid close scrutiny of how they got the power. As Banquo says, that he fears Macbeth played most foully for it. According to the divine right of kings, Macbeth could argue, well, I am the king and therefore God has chosen me to be king. And so any threats to that power, or Macduff, if you want to pipe up and claim you've got a different view, or Malcolm, you've got a claim to the throne, well, you're going against God, and these people are should be executed for not just going against me, the rightful king, but going against God himself. Right, number 7. Quite advanced this. I don't think many candidates, certainly at GCSE, will be referencing this, but this is Shakespeare's source text for Macbeth. It's the Holinshed Chronicles, written in 1577. It's essentially a history book, on a medieval chronicle of the runners and riders of medieval power and politics, and who was in charge. And it sticks. Shakespeare sticks very, very closely to what is written in the history books. There was a king of the name Macbeth who did seem to be swayed by 3 weird women, or sort of magical, mystical women. But there's a couple of key changes. One is that Banquo was in on the original usurpation alongside Macbeth, and so he was arguably just as much guilty of that crime, or just as much of a villain as Macbeth, if that is Macbeth's big crime. Shakespeare's problem is that Banquo is actually the great 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 grandson of James I. So Shakespeare cannot very well sit there and go to the new king, hey, I've got a great play for you. Turns out you're descended from regicidal murderers, and you know, how would that have gone down? It's not a great way to impress your new boss. So Shakespeare has to alter history a little bit and make Banquo the right and noble one, and the one for whom there was a prediction of his issue would be kings. So there's very much an element here of Shakespeare playing to the gallery. Stupid, you know, he's not thick, and he knows he can't badmouth James's ancestors like that. And it does seem to be an element of the original Macbeth, the historical Macbeth, was very well regarded, at least for the first half of his reign, and then became held in less high regard, and the second half of his reign seemed to have been characterized by much more violence and animosity, and all the rest of it perhaps a bit like Arsene Wenger's reign. The first half of it, glory and triumph and victory; in the second half, mired in argument and failure, arguably. Right, but it's worth bearing in mind he was actually very very close to history books in terms of a king called Macbeth that usurped the throne. And the original Macbeth died in 1057, if that helps place him in chronology. Right, number 8, the English saviours. Da, 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 da. In come the English saviours. They ride to the rescue. Hooray for the English. Worth bearing in mind that probably plays quite well with an English audience. It's a bit like, you know, those American Vietnam War films, which incidentally the Vietnamese call the American War. They don't call the Vietnam War. But in those American films like Platoon and so on, the US soldiers are always sort of the heroes, and also in many cases the victims as well, that the audience is encouraged to sympathise with them, feel sorry for, and so perhaps there's an element that Shakespeare similarly, just like Hollywood plays to its own audience, Shakespeare here playing to his own audience, that this goes down quite well with an English audience to think that they are right and noble and restoring the order. And so there's that sense of catharsis, which is restoring of order, and a wrong has been righted. And I think here you should perhaps try and incorporate some Aristotelian terms, such as catharsis, hubris, hamartia, anagnorisis, and protagonist, when you are writing about Macbeth. That will lend your essays sophistication. You will look better read, you will look more informed, and those ideas are not too hard to get your head around. Check out one of my other videos on this playlist, on this Macbeth playlist, if you're not clear on what those terms mean. Right, number 9, the influence of the Italian writer and political philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli. This is very, very important. You really need to get your head around this guy and his writings. They help you to understand the play Macbeth in a much more insightful, informed way. And for any lovers of mafia fiction in books or films of the 20th century, they all revolve around a Machiavellian way of thinking, as does any modern students of politics will be able to see the ideas of Machiavelli running right through every political party and perhaps every politician in Europe, in America, in Russia, North Korea, you name it. So who was Machiavelli? Well, for a full detailed appreciation of Machiavelli's role in Shakespearean thinking and Shakespeare's Macbeth, please check out another video I've posted below on this playlist. But essentially, an overview, he's a political philosopher that is wrote a very famous book, Prince, Il Principe, where he argued about for this is how you get power, and this is how you retain power. And it's not nice, it's not pretty, in fact it's horrible and murderous and violent, but hey, this is politics. It's not a pretty business. And so Macbeth is nothing if not a Machiavel. He becomes completely ruthless in his desire to gain power and to keep hold of it. He is increasingly adept at lying and camouflage and disguise and being fraudulent. and he's tactical and strategic. A couple of examples. He keeps spies in all the other noblemen's houses. There's not a one of them, but in his house I keep a servant feed. So he's paying one of the servants to spy on all the others, such as Macduff. And the very fact that he has a third murderer rocks up to whack Banquo. He doesn't trust the first two murderers. I guess you don't trust the hitman. They're probably not the most trustworthy blokes in the world. So that is quite Machiavellian, quite strategic, quite underhand, but quite clever. And the ends justify the means. So a couple of quotations to back up this idea. Very famously, look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. There's pure Machiavelli. You are outwardly noble and pure, but inwardly the substance of you is devious and calculated and cunning and dangerous. Lady Macbeth with, I fear thy nature's too full of the milk of human kindness. She doesn't think Macbeth's quite ruthless enough, and so she herself goes to work on Macbeth, playing on his insecurities over his manhood or his masculinity, and an attempt to intimidate. And then Macbeth himself, with his desire to wipe out not just Macduff but everyone in his entire family, giving to the edge of the sword his wife, his babes, and so on and so on. Fairly nasty, fairly Machiavellian, fairly ruthless, and fairly comfortable with violence to retain your power at all costs. Right, number 10. This is the idea of the Renaissance man. Now, at this time, there's an idea that if you were truly a man, if you were a man in all respects, then you needed to be a man in three aspects, in three elements: the head, the arm, and the heart. And so the head, then that means the intelligence, the smarts, the cunning, the guile, and Macbeth certainly has this. He is a poet. He's beautiful in some of his expressions, in some of his imagery, in some of the depth of his analysis and his conjecture. He's a highly intelligent individual, as well as that being proved by someone that's able to take the throne and take power and keep hold of it for so long. Undoubtedly he has the arm, he has the strength and the courage, and that's outlined at the start of the play at 1 scene 2, where we get these reports of this ferocious warrior on the battlefield that none can match. And so without doubt he has the arm, the sword, but perhaps the heart is what deserts him. He seems to have that at the start, and he's lauded and respected. However, a combination of factors, his own ambition, the whisperings of the witches, and the perhaps the bullying and the sort of psychological bullying of his wife, and the temptation of the crown and the power and everything that goes with it, corrupt him absolutely, and he doesn't have the heart, and thus he falls. He's a tragic hero that falls and doesn't retain his power in the long term, doesn't come out on top, is instead reduced to being this dead butcher by the end of the play in Malcolm's epitaph of Macbeth. So he doesn't have all three elements and is thus not a Renaissance man. So perhaps worth having a think where you see Macbeth lacking that. Right, that concludes the second of this two-part video. I hope that's of some use to you, and hope that gives you some things to write about and to sprinkle through your essays, make them just that little bit better, that little bit more informed and insightful. If you like this, please make a note in the comments or any requests, and we can do more.
Pressure.